Margaret Atwood, congratulations on the Griffin Lifetime Recognition Award for 2025.
Well, it's a slightly sinister award, as I'm sure you realize.
I was going to talk about that.
Yeah, gold watch and a handshake.
What comes after a Lifetime Recognition Award?
Another one, because you get a second life, right?
Well, this year saw the publication of Paper Boat, a new and selected poems, and that volume contains excerpts from collections between 1961 and 2023, 15 collections, as well as a selection of new poems that you've got there. And for our conversation, we're going to take a hop, skip and a jump through certain poems and look at some of your themes and some experiences and some viewpoints that you have through those poems. You began writing young, it seems to me. I saw various recognitions. How old would you say you were when you began writing?
6 or 7.
What can you recall about the need?
I was an early reader, and I think kids imitate things that they have encountered in their lives. So books were it, since I didn't have access to movies, theater, any of those things. So we lived in the woods.
Yeah. You didn't go to school full-time till you were 12, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Was it part-time previous to that?
Oh, no, it was great. Yeah, the problem was getting used to school, not getting used to no school. But we had the lessons. Yeah. So our mother would just go in and get the workbooks. There were workbooks in those days, and you just filled out the workbook as fast as you could. And then you're out of school, which has made me a very superficial person.
Who were the early poets that you recall that you enjoyed, particularly at a young age?
There wasn't actually that much poetry just for children.
No.
I think we got poems by grown-ups that didn't have sex in them.
But they probably had war and threat in them, but not sex.
Oh, yeah, lots of war. Yeah. Well, why would it not have war? It was the 40s.
You say that poetry is not a rational activity, but is an aural one, and that your poems usually begin with words or phrases that appeal more because of their sound than their meaning. Is that partly coming from an early interest in some of those particular formed shapes of poetry from Robert Louis Stevenson or Mother Goose?
Well, I'm not sure. I think it's always slightly dubious to go back and try to analyze what you were thinking when you were 7. I think if you go in and try to catch yourself in the act of doing it, it's a surefire recipe for freezing. So let us just say that I think that the part of you that does poetry is closer to the part that does music than it is to the part that does ordinary, everyday conversation such as the one I'm having with you.
I wonder if you could read the poem 30, which is from Uncollected Poems, number 2.
Yes, I wouldn't say this is a major poem.
I burst out laughing when I read this one, and so I was curious to think, because it seems to me to encapsulate, we'll talk about it, but it seems to encapsulate some of your themes.
Maybe. I don't know. Let's find out. 30. I stand with my mouth ajar while one girl who is 33 tells another who has just made it to 30 that 30 will be okay. There's a knack to it, she says, because 30 is when you say, I am who I am. This is it. Do you ever reach a point at which you don't find the children hilarious? By children, I mean, you understand, anyone younger than you. Just wait till 40, I think. 40 is when you say, hey, wait, I am not who I am. Let's go over this again. After that, there's a few more surprises, if you get that far into the woods you keep hoping you're out of. We slowly morph into revisionists, that cold, bright ardor, that absolute truth of the firing squad goes to the wall. We lose interest in being right, also in killing. We can't even kill our previous selves. It's pardons all round.
It's the turn that really interested me in that poem. We slowly morph. The way within which there's an observed conversation between two characters, and then there's the speaking, and the who's a child, anybody that's younger than you, and then that turn into the question of time. And it seems to me that you've been writing about time for most of your life. And in this small anecdote, it seemed to crop up again, even in a poem that's filled with humour and filled with observation from an occurrence somewhere public, it seems.
Yes, time. So it was the biographer of Henry James, Leon Adele, who said, if there's a clock in it, it's a novel. A novel is things happening to people over time. So it's very hard, even if you're Samuel Beckett, to write a novel in which nothing happens. But it is possible to write a poem in which nothing as such happens. So, sure, people write about time all the time. And it's certainly hard to write a long narrative poem without time in it. It is theoretically possible, and people have done it, to write a lyric poem in which there isn't any time as such. Because it might be a meditation, it might be a moment of stopped time, which is, however, still about time.
Yeah. It feels like an experience of time in different ways is happening to the different characters in this poem. You know, somebody at 30, somebody at 33, and somebody who's older looking. And so time isn't happening, but some moment of time is being experienced, a phenomenology of it, perhaps.
I'll share this secret with you. Don't tell. Perspectives change as you get older. Now, nobody knows that except you and me.
Nobody at all.
There are some poems that you could not write at the age of 18. And there are other poems that you would not feel like writing at the age of 85.
There is the data of this poem feels like it has some connection with something that might have happened right in front of you. Did this occur in a certain sense, or did you make some of it up?
I beg your pardon. Me? Make things up?
In terms of the conversation between the two, there's so much data, 30, 33.
These conversations do take place.
Yeah,
and yes, I have heard some of them. And people frequently ask, well, do you see things differently now that you're, quotes, older? They don't say old. That's bad form. And of course they do. So I say it to reassure the young that which is a tragic heartbreak when you're 18 will be a funny anecdote when you're 40, and when you're 80 you may not remember the names of those people.
You said in 2020 that poems do not assert, they explore. As you look at this poem, which you said may not be a serious one, what do you think it might be exploring?
Oh, I think it's exploring getting older, but also being younger.
Yeah.
Everybody hits 30 and they think I'm practically dead. And there's news for them too. Not yet. So people used to say that 32 was the crucifixion year, and that if you could get past it, you'd possibly make it to 40. I was on a radio show when I was 28 with a hard-bitten female journalist of, let's say, 50. And she said, so what are you looking forward to in your future? And I said, well, I'm hoping to reach 40. And she gave me this withering look, and she said, you'll make it.
And you definitely have. I'm going to be 50 this year, so I hope to give people withering looks.
Well, I can give you some advice on that too.
Oh, give me some advice.
Yes. Yeah. 50 is good. And between 50 and 60, enjoy. There's a lot of things you don't have to worry about anymore.
It's true. You were born in Ottawa in November 1939, a few months after the outbreak of World War II. And you already mentioned that, the early poems in the 40s, of course they had war in them, even if they didn't have sex in them, because it was just the inevitability of the public conversation. How would you say that has lived on in your imagination and writing?
Oh, I would say pretty major. It certainly focused my interest on dictators and totalitarianisms and on military history, of which I have an extensive library, because not only was my father interested in it, so I inherited his, but my father-in-law was a brigadier general in the Canadian Army in World War II and had also a library, which I also have inherited, and had all of the regimental records of the regiments that he was serving with. So that also meant that we have a strong connection with the Netherlands. The Canadians were given the task of, quotes, clearing the Netherlands, and in especial with the city of Deventer, which was one of the ones that he liberated. So I could go on about this, but the general answer to your question is huge.
The Belfast poet Michael Longley once said, "Poetry is about all of the things that happen to people. War is one of them."
Certainly is.
I wonder about how it is that you see the relationship between art and war and the complexity of that, and trying to think about how it is that art is in conversation with that.
Well, I think the big, huge question is, why do we have either? Why do we have poetry? Why do we have war? What is it about being a human being that involves these kinds of activities? And let's begin with the poetry. I think we've always had, once we had speech, we doubtless had poetry, although it was probably sung poetry rather than, it certainly wasn't written.
Yeah.
So I think it's fundamental. In my novel, Oryx and Crake, the creator of these new perfect human beings tries to do away with music and fails. So can you be a person if you don't have language? And the big leap for proto-human beings was into symbolic thinking. And poetry, of course, is symbolic thinking. I started out trying to be a philosopher, and then realized that, number one, it was going to end up in those years in logical positivism, which I disliked intensely. And also that the main proposition of logic, which is that A cannot be both A and non-A at the same time, is the opposite of poetry. Because A can be both itself and non-A at the same time. In fact, it has to be. So symbolic thinking, poetry, and rhythmical expression, which is, of course, part of music. You can't have music without it, some form.
Yes.
Those things are fundamental to who we are. And it's amazing the number of teenage kids who write poetry.
Yeah.
And they don't go on with it because they're more sensible. They become dentists, as any practical person would do. But you may have noticed that poets are not fundamentally practical.
I met one or two practical poets, but you're right.
Not very.
By and large, not very many.
You'd have to be not a very practical person to, quotes, go in for poetry at any age past 20. You also may notice that when people have weddings or funerals, they don't read long passages of the newspaper. They read poems.
So we hear in what you're saying here about how it is that poetry seems somehow to be fundamental to some part of us, and war.
War is,
Yeah.
I'm sorry to say, also fundamental to some part of us. And we could go as far back as as our close relatives' raids on other groups of our close relatives, namely the war parties of the chimpanzees.
Yeah.
So lots of animals are aggressive. Ants make war in an organized way, that is, lots of them at the same time with a single goal in mind. And so do human beings. So those who have let's say close social relationships seem to be in the habit of attacking other groups of their kind who also have close social relationships. So what is that about? Well, quite often it's about defending territory or acquiring territory. But there's a new theory that modern war is more likely to be about the egos of the leaders. There's all kinds of ways of looking at it, including, how is it done? How successful was this? Why did that fail? There's a lot of that kind of thinking. Why did it break out? Why was Alexander the Great such a weirdo? Many. I would say the literature of war is really inexhaustible. There's a huge amount of it.
There's a macabre fascination with it too. I worked in conflict resolution for many years in Belfast.
Did you? And how did that go?
Well, I mean, when you look at the north of Ireland and British-Irish relations, there are ways within which you can say that unmistakably things are much, much better.
Oh, much better. Yeah, without a doubt. And I think it was probably hell to live through. Complete hell, because everybody was mistrusting everybody else, and you never knew when you were going to be assassinated.
And everything's so close. Yeah, small neighborhoods in extraordinary proximity to each other.
Yeah.
And it seems to me sometimes that there's the fascination of strength within small wars and large wars, but there's vulnerability and creativity. To make something is always small. It's always going to be vulnerable at the beginning. And that, I think, is frightening, which is why I think art brings with it a certain sense of disclosure and vulnerability and even fear.
And how did you move over from conflict resolution into talking to old lady poets?
I'd written poetry my whole life, and so I was really interested in looking at, rather than just resolving conflict, what it might mean to be involved with making. And so working with people in writing poetry, a made thing.
Yes. So let's make rather than destroy. Unfortunately, you can destroy a lot faster than you can make.
Yes. You speak about learning the John McCrae poem in Flanders Fields as a child. And you have a recent poem, I think it's a recent poem, where you recall your grade 5 class reciting in Flanders Fields.
Yes, we were of the age in which we had to memorize poetry. Mm-hmm. And I don't actually think that's a bad thing.
No, yeah. I was very similar, yeah.
I think we started memorizing poems at about that age, and we continued on through high school. So quite a few poems. And the founder of the Griffin Awards, which we are talking in aid of, Scott Griffin, his father decided that it would be a punishment for his misbehavior that he should memorize poems. And he did not, in fact, experience that as a punishment ultimately, and it is probably due to this arrangement that we have the Griffins, because it gave him a lifelong love of poetry.
A fruitful way to use your mind.
Reciting it out loud, that's the other thing the Griffin does. It has this high school program called Poetry and Voice, La Voix de la Poésie, and it's for high school students, and he very cleverly made it so that winners not only get something for themselves, but something for their school, such as football uniforms. So that made it less of a niche interest and more of a group activity. You were cheering for, you were a tennis player. So yes, and I've been to some of these things, and they are amazing. These kids have watched a lot of movies and television. They have very good presentation skills.
I wonder if you could read that poem, my grade 5 class reciting in Flanders Fields.
It's a little bit of background for those who may not have encountered it. In Flanders Fields was by John McCrae, who was in the Canadian Army and died soon afterwards. This was World War I. And it became a kind of emblematic poem for Canadians, and I think also for some British people.
Yes.
And it always came up around what we call Remembrance Day, which is November the 11th, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. And that is when ceasefire World War I took place. Yeah, so November was not the most wonderful month to be born in, I have to say. So it begins with Day of the Dead.
Yeah.
It's not even Halloween. Halloween is over. Then we're just into, dead leaves, Day of the Dead, Remembrance Day, the massacre at Macroom, stuff like that. Yes, okay. My grade 5 class reciting In Flanders Fields, Remembrance Day. The echoes last so long. 70-odd years on, the chorus continued to intone. It was always a ghost story. The dead were speaking through our 9-year-old mouths, line by fumbled line, reciting the fields of blood-red poppies, the singing larks, the guns, the shattered faces, telling how their once living hearts had bled and also loved, and how their hands had failed. But what about the torch? What was it? And why past? Do not break faith, they whispered, and we promised. But why died? But faith in what? Not in, but with, they said. Faith with us, unsleeping. Do not break. Learn it by heart, they said. So we did.
This poem reckons with the dead, and it reckons with writing, as well as reckons with the intelligence and the literatures of childhood. And it seems to me that you have been reckoning with the dead. You've got a book about writing, negotiating with the dead, for so much of your writing. And your earliest collection of poetry was called Double Persephone. And I'm curious to hear about the evolving nature for you about writing about what the dead might say, or writing about the death, or writing about the dead throughout your life.
Name me one poet who has not written about death.
That's true. Yes.
It's one of the big subjects. Love, death, war, time, transcendence, beauty. All of these are core poetic concerns. So you can't really do without them. But as far as death, do you know, I'm sure you do, D.H. Lawrence's poetry?
Yes, some of it, yeah.
Yeah, so you probably know this poem called Blue Gentians.
I don't know if I knew that one.
All right, it's about descending to the underworld and the poet who must do so. And Rilke has one like that too. You have to visit the underworld and then come back up out of it, like Dante, like Aeneas.
Like Gilgamesh.
Like Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is just a little bit different. But it's the same dark journey. He goes through this cave that's full of sparkly jewels. So yes, going to the underworld, coming back up. And that is the last chapter of my book on writing. It's the descent to the underworld, which it seems poets make.
There's a way in which when you write about death, you are writing about what you know and what you don't know, and so circling both the presence and the absence of information. Obviously, the extraordinary presence of information of the basic fact of death, and also circling the mystery and the strangeness of it and the fascination with it in terms of what we don't know. How do you hold together what is known and what is unknown regarding this in your writing?
What a question. I don't think it ever occurred to me to think about that. But let us just take a hop, skip, and a jump over to the side or over to the center and say that the oldest religions we know, and a lot of the ones that we have grown up with, such as Christianity, are death and resurrection stories. So everywhere from Osiris to Jesus, that's the central core. What do you do about death? Is there a way of getting around it? Is there a way of surviving it? Is there a way of continuing on? Where do dead people go? Because we can't quite believe that they don't go anywhere. It's really hard to believe that.
Yeah.
And we can believe three different things simultaneously, and we often do. So Granddad is in the ground, that's his gravestone. Granddad is in the sky with God, we just know he is. And Granddad is still with me because he turned up in my room the other night. So, and we can do all of those things. We can do them all at the same time, and most people do in some form, even if they, quotes, don't believe in an afterlife. So let us make a distinction here between knowledge and belief. So knowledge, as Tennyson said, is what you know. He pronounced it knowledge. Whereas belief, it isn't something you know. Beliefs cannot be proven nor disproven. So it's completely useless to say, I don't believe in death.
You've led us into a conversation that I wanted to have. You described yourself once in a conversation with Bill Moyer as a strict agnostic. I was fascinated by those two words that you used together. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that and then hear that poem in the Secular Night.
Well, let us say that there are dogmas over here, and then there's an opinion that knowledge and belief are two different things. Dogmas are about what you believe. They're not about what you know, though they quite frequently present themselves as what you know. And I think that's where a lot of religions come up against the wall of modern materialistic science. But modern materialistic science, let us say, can only measure material things. That's what it does. It explores the material world. It really can have nothing to say about the world of belief because you can't measure that. And therefore you can neither prove nor disprove the existence of God if God is a spirit, which the religion says it is. Okay?
Yes.
So it's like that. And as far as I'm concerned, atheism is another dogma because it claims to know that the spiritual world of which we've been speaking does not exist. But you can't know that because you can't disprove or prove in relation to material science something that is not material. Do I make myself clear?
Yeah, perfectly clear. I'm fascinated by it.
So therefore, as a strict agnostic, I don't pronounce on the truth or untruth of things that you can't pronounce about in the realm of knowledge. You can't know those things. You can believe those things. That's different.
I wonder if you'd be able to read in the secular night.
In the secular night. In the secular night, you wander around alone in your house. It's 2:30. Everyone has deserted you, or this is your story. You remember it from being 16, when the others were out somewhere having a good time, or so you suspected, and you had to babysit. You took a large scoop of vanilla ice cream and filled up the glass with grape juice and ginger ale, and put on Glenn Miller with his big band sound, and lit a cigarette and blew the smoke up the chimney, and cried for a while because you were not dancing, and then danced by yourself, your mouth circled with purple. Now, 40 years later, things have changed, and it's baby lima beans. It's necessary to reserve a secret vice. This is what comes from forgetting to eat at the stated meal times. You simmer them carefully, drain, add cream and pepper, and amble up and down the stairs, scooping them up with your fingers right out of the bowl, talking to yourself out loud. You'd be surprised if you got an answer, but that part will come later. There is so much silence between the words you say. You say, the sensed absence of God and the sensed presence amount to much the same thing, only in reverse. You say, I have too much white clothing. You start to hum. Several hundred years ago, this could have been mysticism or heresy. It isn't now. Outside, there are sirens. Someone's been run over. The century grinds on.
There is an echo of the title "secular" in the final line there, the century, where they share an etymology, and I'm so interested in how it is that while you highlight the things that cannot be known, there is a clear indication of power as well. This could have been mysticism or heresy. It isn't now. And the defining of something as heresy obviously is a practice of power by those who are the guardians of the gates of what they consider to be truth.
If you have a dogma, you're going to have heresy.
Yeah.
But if you don't have a dogma, things that you know that aren't material, you often feel rather abandoned by the universe.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that dogma can have the promise of comfort and then it ends up being
that's why such things exist. They're very comforting. There is a way to act. There's a way to act that is going to lead you to a post-mortem life. Not very comforting when you actually get down to thinking about it. Like, what would that be like?
Yeah. Who's going to do the administration?
And of course you want to believe that your loved one lives on, but do you want them observing your every moment? Mm-hmm. Possibly not.
Possibly not. Probably not. Yeah.
Do you want them knowing your every thought? Again, possibly not. So yes, these are questions that have bedeviled or be-deified human beings for a very long time.
And have amounted to people self-policing others, perhaps themselves too, and establishing the kinds of things that you explore in so much of your literature.
Sure, but they do that about all kinds of things. Mm-hmm. I think it's called being part of a social group. But we do go through these periods of, for want of a better term, witch panic. And then, or say, red baiting, red hunting, or let us say, socially inappropriate language, cancellation and banishment. We've been doing those kinds of things for a very long time, but the contexts and the things denoted as bad have changed quite radically.
Yeah, different things are deemed heresy now. Yours has been a life of poetry. You released a collection in 1966 and 68, two in 1970, and another in 1971. And all of those collections were doing very different things and employing different kind of voices. Were you aware of the kind of extraordinary productivity of those 5 years with 5 collections, each approaching their subject matter in different ways?
It wasn't unusual for the time and place. I'll give you a little bit of context. It was very hard to publish novels as a Canadian in the 1960s. You would have to get a co-publisher either in Britain or the United States, at which point they would say this novel is too Canadian.
Yeah.
So it was that conundrum. Therefore, most writers of my generation wrote both poetry and prose, and they published a lot more poetry because it was short. And you did it with small publishers who didn't think, 500 was a terrible sales figure. But it wasn't usual to publish a book of poetry and have, thousands of people reading it unless you were Leonard Cohen as a young man or somebody who was already quite well known. So yes, the productivity of poetry was high because you knew you would have a lot of trouble publishing a novel.
What was it that drew you to Susanna Moody? That was one of the collections that was released in 1970, the Journals of Susanna Moody.
We had her book in our house, and I had not read it. I looked at the pictures as a child, and I had been interested in the cover because it had her name with 2 O's in it, and my name also had 2 O's. Something that fascinates my French publishers, and they frequently fool around with the O's on the cover. They made them into glasses on one cover because French names do not have 2 O's in them.
Double O's, yeah.
Looks weird to them. All right, so back to Susanna Moody.
1803 to 1855.
Yeah, exactly. We had school readers in the late 40s, and they would have selections from things. And one of them, oddly enough, had a selection from Susanna Moody's Roughing It in the Bush, which is her account of the terrible time she had when emigrating to Canada. So I had read that, and it's the part where her house burns down in the middle of winter. Quite a stirring passage, and meant something to me because I'd lived in a similar house with a similar iron stove with a similar sort of chimney, and we were always worried about chimney fires. And that's what started her, so I was quite interested in that. And then I forgot all about her. And then I was at graduate school at Harvard, currently beleaguered, but holding firm. And at that time, I wanted to read a lot of modern poetry, but I couldn't get at it because it was in something called the Lamont Library, which was off limits to girls. They might distract the studying male students. In your dreams, I think of some of them, but nonetheless, I couldn't go in there. I could get books out of it if I knew what the books were. But you know what you do in libraries. You browse, you find things that you hadn't expected to find. So I was confined to Widener Library, which was the all-purpose big one. And in the Widener Library, there was a collection of witchcraft and demonology, which I thought was very pertinent to what I was studying, namely 17th century Puritan literature and civilization. I won't tell you what that meant in practice. It was in amongst the witchcraft and demonology. I was immersed in it. And right next to it, somebody had been collecting Canadian literature. Somebody quite old who had evidently then died, and nobody else had continued this work. So it was a fairly early collection, and it included Susanna Moody. There she was, both of her books, Roughing It in the Bush and Life in the Clearings. So I started peeking into them, and then I dreamt that I'd written an opera about Susanna Moody, very unlikely, which had only one person in it, namely Susanna Moody, also very unlikely. I'm not sure you can have an opera with just one person in it. You can have a dramatic monologue, but an opera, not so much. So I thought, what does this mean? It was quite clear, and I pay attention to those things, being a strict agnostic. So I went back and read both of those books, and then I started writing these poems. The poems encompass her entire life, which is in these books and in the introduction to these books. And they're episodic, so they're points in her life, things that actually happened, and based on things she actually said and set down, but the subtext, as it were, because her prose is pretty Victorian and also pretty self-contained. She doesn't, she'll mention emotions that she had, but she won't explore them that much. So that's what I did, and I gave her an afterlife as well. She was having an afterlife because I was reading her books, right?
Yeah. Oh, well, books are a certain experience of an echo of a life that has gone but is still speaking in a certain sense. There's huge alienation in Susanna Moody, and I read a critic who said that alienation and survival are some of the hallmarks of Canadian literature, and that they put you in the same context as somebody who pays attention to alienation and survival. Do you recognize that in your work?
Well, she was pretty alienated. She was this genteel English woman who was thrown into... they went to Canada thinking it was the south of France. They were going to have vineyards. They were going to have, bucolic, pastoral, domestic life. That didn't happen. You got assigned land, and the good stuff with the vines in it was already taken. So they ended up on a rocky, forbidding, forested patch up near Peterborough. And that was no joke, because neither of these people, neither she nor her husband, had any idea of how to live that kind of life. It was a very harsh learning experience for them. So that's what she's writing about. Of course she felt alienated.
Yeah.
Of course she felt up against the need to survive. When it was 30 below and you were living in a log cabin, this was not a joke. And it's no wonder their house burned down. They must have kept that fire on all the time.
Writing is a strange form where it's often done alone, but it creates a kind of community with those who read it later on, if they do, but perhaps a community with your own subjects as well as you write. Susanna Moody's writing seems to evidence the need to do that, to bear witness to something. Would you say, too, that your writing has had a desire to bear witness and to bear witness to community and solitude through the ways that you've written prose and poetry and plays and criticism and commentary?
I think these are good questions for somebody writing a thesis to ask about the person they're studying. But they're probably quite bad questions for a writer to contemplate, because it gets you immediately into the territory of what am I doing? Why am I doing it? What are my themes?
Yeah.
Am I, who's my audience? Am I writing for the reader? Who is the reader? I mean, these are unanswerable questions, but they can give rise to quite a lot of self-doubt. I think writers write because they're writers. And then what they write is going to be determined by time, circumstances, literary conventions of their age, and all of these things that you study when you're a student of literature. But if you stop in the middle when you're writing something and say to yourself, oh, look at me, I'm reflecting the literary conventions of my time, it actually makes you feel kind of useless.
Yeah. I suppose at the heart of what I was thinking about was the relationship with loneliness in the writer.
Let us say that a certain amount of being alone is necessary to write anything. And if you can't do that being alone physically, I think of Jane Austen writing in the midst of all of this family uproar going on. You have the ability to focus and more or less shut out what's going on around you. And this can be very annoying to other people. So possibly it's best that you have a room in which you can do this so that you don't just annoy everybody by not hearing them.
One of the things that I think is consistent in you is attention to the fact that anything might happen. That comes up in Susanna Moody. That comes up in many of the characters in your novels. That the way that life is that you can be going along and then something shocking can happen, or something shocking can happen in nature. Something shocking can happen in politics, and that what you thought was unfolding is not unfolding the way that you thought it might.
Not at all.
And in another piece of your writing, you say this is not fantasy; it's history, as a way of asserting that this is predictable because we have seen it happen before.
It's not predictable because you can't necessarily predict when such a thing is going to happen, or even if such a thing is going to happen. But when it does happen, you recognize that it's happened before, and that this is not some major violation of the universe.
Yeah. When you turn to nature, I see too that you are committed in your poetry, as you even describe nature. And I'd like it if you'd read the poem Three Praises, to using language that is arresting in the way that it describes how also shocking nature can be.
Nature is quite shocking. When I think of Wordsworth, I think, you didn't have a microscope, did you?
That's right.
Yeah, he was into the landscapes, but the hookworms not so much.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, so nature never did betray the heart that loved her. Wordsworth. I want you to think about that. Just
we have some things to say.
Yes. Yeah. So you're interested in, let me see, Three Praises. The dipper, small dust-colored bird with robin feet, walks on the stream bed, enclosed in its nimbus of silver air, miraculous bubble, unknown miracle. Who could have thought it? We think it now, and liverwort on a dead log, earth star, hand, finger by finger. For you, at last, I'd like to make something uncomplicated, some neither god nor goddess, riot between, beyond them, pinch it from dough, bake it in the oven, a stone in its belly, stones lined up on the windowsill, picked off some beach or other for being holy. The hookworm in the eye of the universe, which is the unsteady gaze of eternity, maybe, is beloved. How could it not be, living so blessed in its ordained red meadows of blood, where it waves like a seaweed? Praise be it sings with its Dracula mouth. Praise be. That dipper was an Irish dipper.
Oh, was it?
It was.
I wondered. I love that praise be, with its Dracula mouth, praise be, the repetition of that, and Dracula mouth. I'm coming back to that line that you said in 2020, or you wrote, poems do not assert, they explore. And what are you exploring, do you think, as you read that now? What does it seem to you that poem's exploring?
I think it's exploring the three facets of the natural world. The first one is the one we love, especially if we're bird watchers. Isn't this wonderful? And how weird, but also how extraordinary this bird is. It's nothing much to look at, but it does this really astonishing thing. And you think, what forces of evolution caused this to happen? Something must have, but there it is underneath the water. The second one is it's about stones, which appear to be very simple, but people have relationships with them, and they have had for a very, very long time. Special stones, marker stones, religious stones, and name me one person who's walked on a beach and never picked up a stone. Why that one?
Whether to put it in their pocket or throw it or something, yeah.
Sometimes they put it in their pocket and then throw it away shortly after, but they've picked it up because it, quotes, spoke to them. And the third one is, all right, there's a huge amount of life on Earth that we never see because it's so small. And that it's of enormous variety, and not all of it is benevolent towards us. Let us just mention viruses and bacteria, but also parasites, of which the hookworm is one. And it does live a charmed life unless you get rid of it, because there it is, perfect circumstances for it, namely inside you. So when you say, isn't nature wonderful, you have to include the hookworm.
Yeah, praise be.
Yes, there you are. Though you may not wish to include them.
As we draw to a close, your a lifetime recognition award. Where are you at with writing now? What is it that you're tuning into in terms of the music of poetry that's appealing to you? Are there any new directions in that?
In poetry,
yeah.
I think poetry takes new embodiments, but it hardly ever diverges from its core themes. Or in a book of poetry, you may get some divergences. I love my old car, or something like that.
Yeah.
But you're seldom far from that core, which is the human core, and that's one of the things that poetry does for readers. It puts them in touch with that core in very immediate and emotional ways. Because poetry is emotion. It's not, it can be thought too, but oft so thought but ne'er so well expressed. If it's not well expressed, you're not going to remember it. Or you might remember it for being really, really bad.
Well, on that note, in light of the really, really good, extraordinary volume of your work, your output, your contribution to Canadian literature, world literature, Margaret Atwood, congratulations again on the Griffin Lifetime Recognition Award for 2025. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
A pleasure to talk with you.